Imagine this: the most powerful man in England, the man hailed as defender of the faith by the Pope himself, once sat by candlelight and penned love letters, yes, handwritten, heartfelt letters filled with poetic riddles, heart-drawn initials, and clumsy declarations of devotion that could have passed for the diary entries of a lovesick schoolboy. But these letters were not written to a foreign princess, nor a noble woman of ancient blood. They were written to a lady in waiting, to a clever, captivating, ambitious woman who would one day lose her head for the very love that once crowned her queen. His name was Henry Tudor, Henry VIII. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And this is not a love story. This is a story of obsession, religion, betrayal, and the price women pay when they outshine their kings. Anne Boleyn was never supposed to be queen. She wasn't even supposed to be noticed. The younger daughter of a minor nobleman, she had spent her youth in the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France, learning the games of flirtation, charm, and calculated wit. When she returned to England around the year 1522, it was to serve as a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII. But fate or something darker had other plans. Henry had already dallied with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, and discarded her. But when he saw Anne, everything changed. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, not like the painted portraits of the time, but she had fire in her eyes, a sharpness to her tongue, and an elegance born not of breeding, but of will. And Henry wanted her not for a knight, not as a mistress, but as queen. The problem, he already had one. Catherine of Aragon had been his wife for nearly 2 decades. She had borne him a daughter, Mary. But Nosson, Henry grew restless, convinced his marriage was cursed after all. Catherine had once been married to his late brother. He began seeking an annulment, but the Pope refused. Divorce was not just scandalous, it was heresy. And so, for the sake of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII severed ties with the Roman Catholic Church, tore England away from centuries of religious tradition, and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, all to marry the woman who had dared say no to a king. They wed in secret in January of the year 1533. Anne was already pregnant. The child, they believed, would be a son, a golden prince, to justify the years of chaos, war, and spiritual upheaval. But when the child was born on the 7th of September that same year, it was a girl, Elizabeth. She would one day become the greatest monarch England had ever known. But in that moment, her arrival was met with silent disappointment. Henry had torn the world apart for Anne, and now the world would begin tearing her apart in return. At first, things seemed salvageable. Anne remained Henry's obsession. He showered her with gifts, joined her in archery contests, and received in return jeweled trinkets and handcrafted tokens of her affection. But Anne was not quiet. She was not obedient. She had ideas about policy, religion, and influence. The very qualities that had captivated Henry when she was a forbidden prize became intolerable now that she sat beside him on the throne. And then came the miscarriages, one after another. Rumours swirled. Whispers turned into accusations. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was a witch. But Henry simply grew cold. By the beginning of the year 1536, Anne was standing on the edge of a blade she could not yet see. When Catherine of Aragon died that January, tongues wagged that Anne had poisoned her. And when Anne miscarried again on the very day of Catherine's funeral, Henry seemed to reach a silent verdict. He began courting Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies in waiting. The king had found a new prize, and Anne, once the bright flame of his obsession, was now the shadow he sought to extinguish. Enter Thomas Cromwell. the king's right-hand man and master of ruthless efficiency. He gathered rumors, shaped them into charges, and presented them as truth. Adultery, treason, incest. Anne was accused of sleeping with at least 5 men, including her own brother George. The evidence was flimsy at best. The confessions, likely extracted under pressure, but it didn't matter. The verdict had already been written. On the 2nd of May, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. In a damp stone chamber, once built for royalty, she awaited judgment. She wrote one last letter to Henry, declaring her innocence and her undying loyalty. But it was never answered. Her so-called lovers were tried first. All but one denied the charges. All were sentenced to death. Anne's trial was a spectacle. The jury included her former fiancé. The outcome was inevitable. She was found guilty. The punishment for a queen who committed adultery was to be burned alive. But Henry, in a rare act of calculated mercy, arranged for a French swordsman to be brought to London, an expert who could deliver a swift, clean death. And so, on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn knelt on the grass in the Tower courtyard. She wore a gown of ash-grey silk. Her hair was tucked beneath a simple coif. She prayed aloud for the soul of the king. She did not cry. She did not scream. The sword flashed in the morning light, and in a single stroke, the woman who had changed the course of English history, who had defied a pope, captivated a nation, and given birth to a future queen, was gone. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. The court moved on. Anne's portraits were removed. Her name was scrubbed from records. Her very memory was erased. But some ghosts don't vanish. Some queens refuse to stay buried. And this is just the beginning. Long before the sword was forged in France, before the cries of traitor echoed through stone halls, and before Anne Boleyn's name was etched onto the scaffold of history, there were the letters. They were not written in a rush, nor were they scrawled with the blunt force of a command. They were deliberate, aching, and, at times, strangely tender, composed by a man who could summon armies with a seal, yet struggled to summon the heart of a woman who would not yield. It is in these letters, preserved not in England but in the quiet, velvet-shadowed vaults of the Vatican Library, that we find not a king, but a man slowly losing control not just of his throne or his kingdom, but of himself. There are 17 surviving letters, 17 fragments of longing and frustration, passion and pride. In them, Henry VIII is not the colossus we see in paintings, broad-shouldered, thunder-browed, draped in furs and gold. No, here he is softer, uncertain, almost boyish. He calls Anne mine own sweetheart. A phrase so intimate, so unguarded. It is almost difficult to believe it was ever whispered by the same lips that later uttered her death sentence. In one letter, he writes that he has been suffering for more than a year with the wound of her refusal, that he has been struck with the dart of love, and that only her mercy can cure him. He signs not with a royal flourish, but with a crude little heart drawn around their initials H and A, a schoolboy's doodle, inked by a sovereign. But these were not the idle ramblings of an infatuated man. They were traps spun in silk, snares baited with honeyed words. Each letter was a thread pulled from Anne's will, and though she held the other end tightly for as long as she could, the correspondence would eventually bind her to the fate she could never escape. The letters became a courtship, yes, but more than that, they became a campaign. Every word he sent, every riddle and rhyme, every metaphor of servitude and chivalric love, was another step away from Catherine and toward the storm that would be Anne. Henry, like all men of power, Loved games he thought he could win. Courtly love, that highly stylized ritual of flirtation. Rejection and romantic conquest was a game he had mastered, but Anne Boleyn did not play to lose. Unlike her sister Mary, who had given herself to the king and been dismissed without consequence, Anne made herself unattainable. She refused him, her body, offered only her wit, and demanded something no one had ever dared to ask of Henry patience. And for a time, he gave it. For more than 5 years, he pursued her, not as a mistress, but as a future queen. In the language of the letters, he casts himself as the servant, the knight, the supplicant. He speaks of devotion, of despair, of sleepless nights and endless waiting. He begs for a token not of affection, but of possession, a promise, a vow. Anne, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, gives him only delay. There is an aching irony buried in those pages. Henry believed he was chasing a woman, but in truth, he was unraveling a kingdom. Each letter he wrote was a step deeper into the labyrinth of spiritual rebellion. In seeking Anne, he began dismantling the world. Catherine had come to represent the sacred marriage, the alliance with Spain, the authority of Rome. And yet, for all that upheaval, the letters themselves remain strangely human. They are the cries of a man who, in his rare moments of vulnerability, wanted something he could not command: love, acceptance, a woman who would see the man beneath the crown and choose him anyway. One letter, likely penned in the year 1528, stands out in its desperation. Henry writes that he can no longer suffer the absence of his beloved, that he longs to know the place which she would have in his heart. The line reads like the plea of a prisoner, but it is not Henry who is trapped. It is Anne, for in that moment, she begins to see what kind of love she is dealing with, not the love of a man for a woman, but the obsession of a king for a symbol. She was no longer simply Anne Boleyn. She had become the key to England's future, the mother of its hoped for heir, the prize that would justify rebellion against the church itself. And from the moment she accepted his letters, not just read them, but responded, she was bound, not by law, not yet, but by the gravity of a desire too large to orbit safely. The letters also speak in ciphers, literal ones. Henry often ended his messages with secret codes, puzzles, or clever turns of phrase. This, too, was a part of courtly love, but it was more than mere custom. In encoding his words, Henry was also encoding his intentions. Anne was to be no secret forever. She was being prepared slowly, carefully for the crown, and with every cleverly disguised sentence, Henry drew her closer to the edge of history's blade. Historians debate whether Anne ever truly loved him. Some say she was ambitious, cold, politically calculating. Others suggest she was swept up in the tidal force of his attention, intoxicated by the idea of being chosen, not just by any man, but by the man. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that Anne wrote back, that she replied to his riddles, that she accepted the jewelry, the titles, the gifts, that she let herself believe, perhaps only for a while, that she could hold the lion by the mane and not be devoured. And so, the letters continued. With every word exchanged, the stakes rose higher. Anne's family began to rise in court. Her father was granted lands. Her brother was given a seat of influence. Catherine's allies began to whisper. Rome grew suspicious. The Pope grew angry. But none of it stopped the ink from flowing. Henry, obsessed, refused to be denied. Anne, entangled, could not step away. And the letters, those trembling, poetic scraps of paper, became a record of both their ascent and their doom. What is most chilling, perhaps, is the knowledge that the very hands which once caressed the parchment with love would later sign Anne's death warrant. That the man who wrote of eternal loyalty and unmatched desire would, just a few years later, accuse her of crimes unspeakable, stand silently as she was convicted without evidence, and ride to the hunt while she prepared to meet the blade. The ink of those love letters had not even faded before. Her blood was spilled upon the grass of the tower. Today, those 17 letters remain under lock and key, surrounded by Vatican silence. They are rarely shown, seldom touched, and almost never read aloud. Perhaps the Church understands that they are not just relics of royal courtship. They are prophecies soft and deadly. They whisper of a woman whose rise was written in candlelight and whose fall was signed in blood. They sing of a love that was never meant to survive, only to destroy. And when you read them, even now, you can hear the rustle of silk against stone, the clatter of a sword being drawn, the slow tread of footsteps through a tower hallway, and the echo of a woman's voice whispering into the silence. "Mine own sweetheart, was this your plan all along? But that is a question for tomorrow." Tonight, we fold the letters carefully, place them back in the drawer of history, and drift into the next chapter. A chapter where Anne's crown weighs heavier than her heart, and every smile she gives is watched by the eye of a man who believes kings do not make mistakes. When the gold was finally placed upon her head, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like thunder. Anne Boleyn stood tall that June morning, robed in fabric, embroidered with golden thread, beneath banners of crimson and silver, while the people of London lined the streets with eyes that did not shine. Some watched with curiosity, others with disgust. A few dared to whisper prayers for the woman they still called a usurper. But Anne did not flinch. She rode through the city like a queen, born not of lineage but of will, and perhaps that was the very reason the crown burned against her scalp, like iron left too long in fire. This was not a coronation of celebration. It was a coronation of defiance. A spectacle designed to silence doubters and sanctify what the Church refused to bless. And yet, beneath the music, beneath the pageantry, beneath the artificial smiles carved into the faces of nobles paid to cheer, there was something else, a shadow clinging to the edge of every painted banner, a silence that rang louder than bells. Anne had waited so long for this. She had danced the slow, excruciating waltz of courtship with a married king for over 7 years. She had endured hatred from the people, suspicion from Rome, humiliation from whispers that she was nothing but a seductress with a clever tongue. She had delayed, resisted, calculated, and then, when the king had torn his country from the Catholic Church for her, when he had made himself the supreme head of a new religious order to annul his first marriage, Anne finally agreed to be his wife. They married in secret, not once, but twice. The first ceremony in November of the year, 1532, and the second in January of the year, 1533. But a secret marriage did not make her queen. The people needed to see it. The nobles needed to kneel. The streets needed to hear her name shouted over drumbeats. So Henry staged a spectacle. It was unlike any coronation before or after. For the first time in English history, a queen consort would be crowned not with a token circlet or a borrowed tiara, but with St. Edward's crown, a symbol of sovereign power once reserved only for reigning monarchs. That single decision, that single jewel-studded weight made Anne's position both unshakable and unbearable. For a brief moment, she was more than queen. She was something sacred, untouchable, ordained not by Rome, but by Henry's word. Yet, that same crown, placed with such ceremony upon her head in Westminster Abbey, also made her a target from every direction. The nobles who had supported Catherine, the ambassadors who feared Spain's retaliation, the peasants who still called her the whore, even those within her own household, all now looked at Anne not as a woman, but as a threat. And then came the child. Anne had already been pregnant at the time of her coronation. Her belly, barely rounded beneath the heavy robes, carried what many hoped would be a boy, the long-awaited male heir who would justify the king's rebellion against the Pope, who would secure the Tudor line, who would transform Anne's controversial rise into divine providence. But on the 7th day of September, in the year 1533, Anne gave birth to a girl. The child was named Elizabeth, beautiful, healthy, and red-haired like her father, but unmistakably female. Henry, who had waited years and moved mountains for this moment, did not speak of his disappointment aloud, but it hovered like fog through the corridors of Greenwich Palace. A boy would have solidified Anne's reign. A girl merely prolonged the gamble. Still, Anne tried. She smiled for the court. She planned christenings and hosted tournaments. She resumed her clever dance of political maneuvering, siding with Protestant reformers and keeping close to those who had once championed her ascent. She dressed magnificently, laughed loudly, and kept Henry's interest with sharp conversation and shared enemies. She gave him lavish gifts, including a ship decorated with precious stones and a bed of velvet embroidered with their joined initials. For a time, it worked. Henry still visited her chamber. He still called her my Nan in private. He still seemed to believe that fate had not yet finished blessing their union. But behind closed doors, Anne was beginning to feel it. The tightening of the crown, not upon her head, but around her throat. Her enemies were multiplying. Her allies, many of them made rich and powerful through her influence, began to retreat into silence. The people still mourned Catherine, who had been banished but never forgotten. Mary, Catherine's daughter, refused to acknowledge Anne as queen, and Anne, in turn, treated the girl cruelly, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of fear. Even within the court, new girls began to appear, young, fresh-faced ladies who giggled too long in the king's presence, who wore colours that matched the queen's, who lingered in hallways with hopeful smiles. Among them was Jane Seymour, quiet and obedient, everything Anne was not. Then came the miscarriages. In the year 1534, Anne lost her second pregnancy. Another followed. And then, perhaps most tragically, in January of the year 1536, the same month that Catherine of Aragon was buried, Anne miscarried again. It was a boy. She had been more than 3 months along. The loss broke something in Henry. The symbolism was too loud to ignore. Catherine dead, a son lost, Jane Seymour waiting, and Anne weeping in bed, with no more miracles to offer. Henry's Gaza shifted, and with it, so did the ground beneath Anne's feet. The very crown that had once made her queen now marked her for ruin. It had been placed not just upon her head, but into the crosshairs of every ambition in court. She was no longer useful. Worse, she was inconvenient. She had become the reminder of a gamble that had not paid off. And when kings are embarrassed, Queen's Blate, Anne, ever perceptive, must have known. She must have seen it in Henry's eyes, the coldness where warmth once lived, the calculation behind every word, the way her laughter no longer brought his. She must have sensed the courtiers watching her with the same expression one gives to a candle burning low. She must have heard the footsteps of Thomas Cromwell in the halls. I must have noticed that those who once bowed now barely nodded. The crown was still on her head, but its weight had changed. It was no longer glory. It was a burden, a warning, a countdown, and perhaps, in the silence of her chamber, when the music had ended and the courtiers had gone, Anne would sit before her mirror, look into her own dark eyes, and ask the question she had never dared speak aloud. What price had she paid to be called queen? What part of herself had she bartered for the crown? And when the answer came not in words, but in cold realization, it would not be fear that gripped her. It would be understanding that she had climbed too high, that she had loved too boldly, that in a world built for obedient wives and silent queens, she had dared to wear the crown like a conquest, not a gift. And now it was coming to collect. There are many ways a queen can fall, some by dagger, some by decree. But Anne Boleyn's fall began in silence, beneath the silk canopy of her own bed, in the rhythm of heartbeats that never found breath. History speaks of her miscarriages as footnotes, dryly recorded by men who never felt the blood warm between their thighs, never held stillborn hope in their arms, never wept behind a closed door for a future that had flickered and vanished before it could cry. But for Anne, every lost child was more than grief. It was treason against her very purpose. For a woman who had torn a kingdom in half to sit beside the king, the failure to produce a son was not misfortune. It was a sentence. From the very beginning, her womb was watched more closely than her words. Every change in her appetite, every hand pressed to her belly, every whisper from her maids became court gossip. Speculation turned strategy. When Anne first became pregnant sometime in the winter before her coronation, it was treated as a divine omen, the proof that God, if not Rome, had approved of her union with Henry. She was triumphant, glowing with promise, surrounded by advisors and midwives, astrologers and priests, all predicting that a boy would be born, a prince to make England new again. But Elizabeth arrived instead, healthy, radiant, and female, and though the child was received with pageantry and formal celebration, no one could ignore the stillness in Henry's eyes. Anne understood what it meant. A queen who produced daughters was a queen on borrowed time. Still, she did not give up. Her second pregnancy was kept quieter, and when it ended too soon, a loss whispered behind heavy doors. She covered her sorrow with court laughter and careful distraction. She wore bright colours. She danced. She laughed louder than before. But even then, behind her painted smile, she must have felt the noose tightening. Henry, once content to wait, began to turn toward younger faces. He spent longer at hunting lodges, lingered at feasts with Jane Seymour, whose soft voice and downcast eyes reminded him of Catherine, the wife who had never dared to argue. By the year 1534, Anne was once again with child. It was her chance at redemption, and she knew it. Everything hung on the heartbeat within her, not her beauty, not her charm, not even her wit, which had once made Henry grin like a boy, only the baby, only the son. But once again, fate, or something crueler, intervened. The pregnancy ended, another whisper of hope extinguished before it could scream. And this time, the court did not pretend to be kind. The whispers were colder, the eyes more distant. Some said it was God's punishment for Catherine's tears. Others claimed it was the devil's trick that Anne had bewitched the king and now paid the price for her sorcery. There were murmurs of potions, of hidden marks on her body, of a sixth finger said to curl when she wept. None of it was true. But in a court hungry for blame, truth mattered less than whispers. But the final blow came in January of the year, 1536, a month already, heavy with ghosts. Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th day of that month. In the cold chambers of Kimbolton Castle, alone and exiled, yet still a queen in the eyes of many. Her funeral was held with solemn dignity, and yet Anne did not attend. She could not. She was pregnant again. And this time the signs were hopeful. She believed, perhaps desperately, that this child would be the son she had been promised in dreams and prayers. But on the very day of Catherine's burial, Anne miscarried once more. And when the blood came, it came not just as tragedy, but as prophecy. It was a boy, a perfectly formed prince, gone. No written record can capture what that moment did to her. To hold in her body the child who could have changed everything, who could have secured her place, silenced the court, erased the doubts, and to lose him on the very day her greatest rival was laid to rest, was not just misfortune. It was a sign, a divine reversal, a cruel echo of fate's laughter. Even Henry, hardened by battle and ego, could not ignore the symbolism. From that day forward, something inside him snapped. His warmth, already thinning, vanished completely. He began to speak of Anne differently, not as his queen, but as his mistake, and she, in turn, began to realize that the crown she wore was no longer a gift, but a knife pressed to her throat. Henry, perhaps seeking comfort, or perhaps seeking revenge, turned fully to Jane Seymour, her quiet obedience, her gentle menace. Her refusal to challenge him became the balm to Anne's fire. Unlike Anne, Jane never raised her voice in court. She never offered political counsel, never spoke out of turn. Where Anne had been heat, Jane was water, and Henry, weary of burning, chose to drown. But even this might not have destroyed Anne, had her body not betrayed her. A queen could forgive a king his infidelity. She could endure rumors, political shifts, even public hatred. But she could not survive the loss of her purpose. Anne had built her throne not on lineage, but on the promise of a son, and now that promise was broken. Not once, not twice, but thrice. And it was enough. The court began to shift beneath her feet. Those who had once bowed deeply now merely nodded. Old allies visited less often. Enemies, sensing blood in the water, circled with sharpened tongues. Thomas Cromwell, who had once helped elevate Anne, now worked quietly to undo her. He had grown tired of her influence, her alignment with religious radicals, her interference in the affairs of men. And Henry, the man who once wrote sonnets for her in secret, who had begged her for favours, who had called her mine own sweetheart, now referred to her in private as cursed. He did not need her anymore. Worse, she had become inconvenient. And yet, Anne did not run. She did not retreat into quiet exile. She wore her silks, braided her dark hair, smiled at courtiers with the same sharp eyes that once ensnared a king. Perhaps she believed she could win him back. Perhaps she believed that even if Henry no longer loved her, he would remember the wars he waged in her name. But Henry did not remember, or rather, he remembered differently. He remembered the frustration, the waiting, the battles with Rome, the isolation from Catholic Europe, the daughters, the miscarriages, the dead boy. And in the darkness of his thoughts, a new possibility took root. Perhaps Anne had tricked him. Perhaps she had seduced him through unnatural means. Perhaps her miscarriages were not God's punishment for his sins, but evidence of her own. A whisper found its way to his ears, the French word sortilège. The idea that he had been bewitched by her laughter, her lips, her ambition. It was easier to believe than the truth that he had chosen her, destroyed everything for her, and now had nothing to show for it. And so, when Anne returned to court after her final miscarriage, she found it changed. The halls felt colder. The smiles felt tighter, and the man who once called her beloved now looked at her like a problem. The womb that had once promised salvation had become the evidence of her failure, and failure, for queens, has never been forgivable. There is a moment often quiet, almost always alone, when every powerful woman who has walked too far ahead must stop, turn slightly, and catch her reflection in the polished glass of her own ambition. For Anne Boleyn, that moment came not in the roar of a courtroom, nor in the final echo of a blade, but in the still hours of early spring, when her body had failed her, her husband had withdrawn, and her crown sat lopsided, atop a kingdom that no longer whispered her name with awe but spat it with venom. She looked into her mirror, not the gilded one hung by servants in her royal apartments, but the mirror history places in every corridor of power, and for the first time, she saw not a queen, but a warning. The face that stared back was no longer aglow with the fire of conquest. It was thinner now, haunted at the edges, lined not with age, but with knowing. And behind those black, intelligent eyes flickered the realization that she had become a character in someone else's story, not the heroine she had imagined, but the villain being written by men who never loved her, and one man who no longer did. The court around her had shifted. Where once there had been compliments, now there were curt nods. Where once her presence had turned heads, now it made them turn away. They said she had changed, that she had grown cold, hysterical, sharp-tongued, that her laughter sounded more like mockery, her elegance more like vanity. But the truth was that she had not changed at all. They had the same wit that had once enraptured Henry now irritated him. The same political instinct that had helped him break from Rome now felt like interference. The same voice that once made him listen now made him clench his jaw. Anne had always been too much for the world she was born into. But when a woman's too muchness is no longer convenient to a man, it is not tolerated, it is punished. She saw the punishment coming. Not in the form of formal accusations. Not yet. But in the slow decay of trust. The way Thomas Cromwell no longer lingered at her side during court discussions. The way Jane Seymour's hands always seemed folded just right. Her eyes always downcast. Her voice always just loud enough for Henry to hear. Anne had danced this dance before, but never as the fading queen. She had always been the flame, the future, the throne just out of reach. Now she was the past, and she could smell smoke. But what haunted her more than the whispers was the question they all carried beneath their breath. Had she become what they claimed? The poisoner, the sorceress, the seductress, the monster in pearls. She had always fought with words sharper than any sword, but now those words cut into her own silence. Was it ambition that led her here, or delusion? Had she overreached? Had she loved too hard? Had she ever truly been loved at all? She remembered the letters, those fragile little bridges Henry had built between them, filled with riddles and warmth. She remembered the heat in his gaze, the first time he called her my Nan. She remembered the first kiss that broke all the rules. But when she reached for those memories now, they felt distant, as if they belonged to another Anne in another world. The man who had once risked heaven and hell to be with her now barely touched her hand, and as his affection withered, so too did his patience. The king had never been a man to sit comfortably in disappointment. He needed someone to blame, and who better than the woman whose womb had failed, whose presence now agitated his conscience, whose enemies had become his allies. But Henry, ever the actor, did not confront her with rage. He confronted her with absence. Cold, deliberate absence. The most calculated cruelty of all. When he smiled at Jane, Anne saw it. When he avoided her gaze in council, she felt it. When he left her alone at banquets, walking past her as if she were a chair, she heard it louder than any shout. And then, one day, the mirror cracked, Anne heard it not from Henry's lips, but in the murmur of her ladies, in the guarded expressions of her servants. The word had begun to drift witch. It had always been there, under the surface, but now it surfaced like oil in water. Some said she had used dark charms to seduce the king. Others swore they had seen her speaking to shadows in foreign tongues. A sixth finger, a mark on her neck, a laugh that came too suddenly, a gaze that lingered too long. In a court that had no room for powerful women, power itself became unnatural, and Anne, who had always been many things too clever, too bold, too unrelenting, was now too dangerous. She knew these rumors. She had seen them before, thrown like stones at any woman who dared walk alone through the halls of men. But still, they shook her, because they were not just cruel. They were strategic. They were scaffolding for something worse. And it came, piece by piece. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, now whispered to Henry that the people would rejoice if the Queen were gone. He cited unrest, disapproval, the risk of rebellion. He hinted that Anne's enemies might move against her if the king did not. He painted her not just as undesirable but unsafe. Henry, already drowning in his own regret, took the suggestion as prophecy. Soon after, Anne noticed changes. Guards posted outside rooms they had once ignored. Questions from old friends that no longer sounded friendly. Invitations rescinded. Meetings moved without her knowledge. A maid dismissed without explanation. Even her own brother, George, once her most trusted confidant, seemed distant. The Queen of England was being quietly unmade. But what made Anne truly tremble was not the loss of favour. It was the loss of narrative. She no longer controlled her story. Others were writing it now, and they were writing her as a villain. In the days that followed, Anne began to speak less and pray more. She knelt longer in chapel. She wrote letters with ink that smudged from her hands, shaking. She stared longer at Elizabeth, her bright, curious little girl, and wondered what stories they would tell her. Would Elizabeth remember the mother who fought for her place in a man's world? Or would she grow up hearing only that her mother was a traitor, a witch, a queen whose crown cracked under the weight of her own ambition? Anne looked again in the mirror, and this time she saw it clearly. Not the monster they claimed, but the monster they needed, because men like Henry do not lose, and when they do, they find someone to bury. It began not with a public accusation, but with a knock on the door on the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536. Anne Boleyn was arrested. No fanfare, no formal declaration of treason, just the soft, deliberate intrusion of authority into her private world. Like frost crawling silently up a window pane. One moment she was queen, the next she was not. They came for her while she was still trying to steady herself from her final miscarriage, while the blood in her body was still reminding her of the son she would never meet. And yet, she did not cry. She did not beg. She walked with dignity to the barge that would take her to the Tower of London, a place where kings were crowned and traitors were buried. And as she stepped onto the cold stones of her prison, perhaps she already knew the truth. The trial was never meant to be a search for justice. It was a theatre cruel, précis, and scripted well in advance. The charges against Anne were stacked like firewood: adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother George, conspiracy to kill the king, and bewitchment that had ensnared the royal will. It was not enough to remove her. She had to be stained, broken, mort de grotesque. They did not simply want her executed, they wanted her erased, and the trial was to be her unmaking. She was imprisoned in the same royal apartments within the tower that she had once prepared to sleep in before her coronation. What cruel symmetry! In those very chambers, Only 3 years earlier, she had stood radiant in anticipation of becoming queen. Now, stripped of her title, she waited for the judgment of men she had once passed in the corridors of court, nodding graciously, unaware that one day they would sit on the jury that would decide her life. 5 men had already been arrested. One of them was Mark Smeaton, a Flemish musician, low-born, talented, harmless. He was the only one to confess, likely under the pressure of torture or the promise of a quick death. The others courtiers, noblemen. Even her own brother denied everything. But it did not matter. Their guilt had already been agreed upon. Their names already crossed out from the book of the living. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was accused of sleeping with his own sister. A charge so vile, it seemed almost too absurd to believe, which is precisely why it worked. The more obscene the accusation, the harder it was to defend. Logic became treason, dignity became arrogance, and silence became guilt. Anne was allowed no legal counsel. She was to defend herself, alone. The trial was held in the Great Hall of the Tower, before an audience packed with noblemen, foreign ambassadors, and watchful courtiers who dared not look away. Presiding over it all was her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, chosen not for his impartiality, but for his loyalty to the crown and his quiet willingness to destroy his own kin. The irony ran as deep as the river beneath the tower's walls. Anne stood before them, not weeping, not trembling, but proud, poised, and devastatingly articulate. She answered every question with clarity, denied each charge with conviction, and maintained her innocence not as a plea, but as a fact. Those present that day would later write of her composure, of how her voice never cracked, of how she met the eyes of her accusers without blinking. But in that room, truth was not the goal. Submission was, and Anne Boleyn, even in chains, would not submit. The evidence presented was laughably thin dates that did not match, locations that made the alleged affairs physically impossible, witnesses who offered no first-hand knowledge. Yet it was assembled with the solemnity of Scripture, read aloud with the gravity of gospel, and received by the jury like prophecy. It was not what they could prove that mattered. It was what the king wanted to believe, or rather, what he needed to believe in order to love Jane Seymour with a clean conscience. When Anne was finally asked how she responded to the charges, she spoke not with anger, but with something closer to sorrow. She reminded them that no wife had ever been more loyal, that she had given the king her body, her mind, her hopes, that she had risked everything to be his queen, and now stood before them condemned without a single piece of real proof. Her words, by all accounts, moved the room, but not enough. Not enough to stop the tide that had already been set in motion. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty. Guilty of adultery. Guilty of incest. Guilty of conspiring to kill the king. Guilty of being the monster they had written into existence. The sentence was death. For the men, it would be the axe. For Anne, the traditional sentence was to be burned alive. But Henry, in a gesture that some still call mercy and others still call mockery, changed the sentence to beheading, and not by axe, but by sword, a clean, swift cut. A foreign blade, wielded by an executioner summoned from Calais, a man known for his precision, as if the horror of the act could be lessened by its neatness. In the quiet after the trial, Anne returned to her cell. Her fate was sealed, and yet, even then, she did not break. She prepared herself for death, not with panic, but with prayer. She asked for books of devotion. She spoke kindly to her attendants. She wrote a final letter to Henry, or perhaps never finished it. No one knows for sure. What is known is that she never once confessed, not even to save herself, because there was nothing to confess. And perhaps that is what frightened them most. That in the end, the woman they tried to paint as a temptress, a traître, a witch, a whore, and a liar, would go to her death with nothing but grace, because dignity, in the face of power, is the most dangerous rebellion of all. The sword had already arrived. It was not an English blade. It came from across the sea, slender and elegant, curved slightly at the tip, forged, not for butchery, but for precision, a weapon of art, not force. It had been carried carefully across the channel from Calais, wrapped in oiled cloth and reverence, as if it were sacred. The man who brought it was silent, efficient, and foreign swordsman summoned by royal decree, not to fight a war, but to end a woman. And while England argued in whispers and courtiers rehearsed their grief, the sword waited, quietly, patiently, like it had always known it would be called. Anne Boleyn, too, waited. The verdict had been read. The sentence passed. There was nothing left to appeal to, not mercy, not law, not love. Her world had narrowed now to stone walls, a small window, the dull creak of a wooden door, and time, strange, elastic time. Sometimes it crawled, sometimes it disappeared. She spent her final days not screaming or weeping, but organizing, arranging the details of her own departure, choosing her gown, praying, writing final words that would be read by no one or by everyone. Depending on which way history turned its head, she asked to be buried in a simple chest. Not a coffin, no royal wood for a fallen queen. The date of her execution shifted like mist. First it was to be the 15th of May, then the 16th, then the 17th. Each morning she rose, dressed, and waited to die. And each evening she was told it would be tomorrow. And in those days, the waiting itself became a form of death. Every footstep outside her chamber door might have been the one. Every pause in the hallway could have meant the scaffold had been built. It was not the sword that tormented her. It was the silence that came before it. She spent her nights praying not for release, not for rescue, but for forgiveness, for peace, for her daughter, little Elizabeth, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, would never again feel her mother's fingers in her hair or hear her voice calling across the nursery. Anne had no delusions about legacy. She knew that in court, she would be remembered as guilty, that songs would be sung about her pride, her downfall, her ambition, that ballads would mock her with rhymes about her beauty and her neck. But she also knew that truth had a way of surviving, and in the quiet, she dared to imagine that one day her daughter might grow old enough to ask the right questions and hear the right answers. On the night before, she was finally told the execution would take place. She slept little. She gave her final belongings to her ladies a prayer book, a locket, a ring. She knelt in prayer again and again, her knees aching on the cold stone. And when the sun began to rise over the grey horizon, she asked only for one thing: that the sword be quick, that her end be clean, that her dignity, the one thing they had not yet taken, be hers to keep. Even in death, the Tower Green was silent that morning. May the 19th, the year 1536. The air was still, damp, the kind of morning where the light seems filtered through cotton, neither bright nor dark, as though the heavens had closed their eyes. A scaffold had been built, not where most executions took place, but on a private lawn within the tower walls, out of view from the public masses. This was not mercy. It was containment. Henry did not want mourning. He wanted control. Anne emerged, dressed not in black, but in a gown of deep grey damask, lined with fur, with a crimson kirtle beneath. Her dark hair was bound tightly, her neck bare. Upon her head she wore a modest headdress, not a crown, not even a pearl. Nothing that might suggest she was anything more than a condemned woman. But as she stepped onto the scaffold, every witness who saw her that day would later say the same thing. She carried herself like a queen. The crowd was small, a few courtiers, a few soldiers, the Duke of Suffolk, the Lieutenant of the Tower, and the swordsman still silent, still unknown, his blade hidden beneath his cloak. Anne turned to the crowd. She was not permitted to speak at length, only to address her guilt and the king, and in that moment, she did not cry out against injustice. She did not proclaim innocence. Though she had done so every day before, what she gave was a farewell. She thanked God for her blessings. She spoke of her loyalty to Henry, called him a good and gracious king. She asked the gathered crowd to pray for her soul. And most chillingly, she forgave him, the man who had signed her death, with a flick of his ringed hand, who had once kissed her fingers and now removed them. "I die, the king's faithful servant," she said. But God's first. It was not fear that shook those who heard her words. It was her calm, her stillness, the absence of rage, as if she had already stepped one foot into eternity and found no monsters waiting there. She knelt, carefully, on the straw-covered scaffold, removed her headdress, covered her eyes with a linen cloth. Her lips moved the final prayer. Her ladies wept behind her, hands pressed to their mouths, unable to speak. The crowd held its breath. The swordsman stepped forward, but he did not raise the blade immediately. Instead, he whispered something in French, a distraction, a word of comfort, or perhaps a trick to ease her final seconds. Then, in one motion, so swift it seemed to happen in silence, the sword fell. Her head dropped onto the straw. And with it, the illusion that a queen could rule without a son, without a church behind her, without fear. The tower fell still. Her ladies wrapped her body in white cloth. Her head was placed beside her, in a plain wooden chest, not even a coffin. There was no anthem, no procession, no mourning bell. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, beneath the very stones she had once walked upon as a crowned consort. No marker, no epitaph, just dust and silence, and the fading echo of a blade that had waited too long. And somewhere in a nearby palace, Henry VIII took Jane Seymour's hand, and history moved on. But something had changed, for in the precise surgical cut that removed Anne Boleyn from the world, England itself had been altered. The woman they tried to erase would live on not only in her daughter, who would rise from disgrace to become a legend, but in every question left unanswered, every painting left unsigned, every truth too dangerous to speak. The sword had waited quietly, but it did not silence her. Not really. Not forever. History has a peculiar talent for forgetting the inconvenient. It forgets in layers, not all at once, but gently, deliberately, like brushing dust over an unwanted name carved into stone. Anne Boleyn. Once the storm that rewrote the order of Europe. Once the queen whose laughter rewrote liturgies and whose eyes made kings tremble, became after the sword no more than a shadow, a whisper in court, a line struck from the page. Her name was not spoken. Her image was removed from paintings. Her initials, once carved into wood beside Henry's with hearts and roses, were gouged out, scraped over, smoothed away. Even her motto, "The most happy," was silenced. For a woman who had shaken an empire, she was buried as if she had never lived, and in her place, draped in pale silks and modest silence, came Jane Seymour. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married her. There was no long mourning, no black banners, no retreat from public life to grieve. The wedding was held in secret. Again, at the Palace of Whitehall, swift, quiet, and clean. Jane did not wear a crown. She did not need to. Her value was not in her voice, or her politics, or her charm. It was in her purity, hair, obedience, and the unspoken promise she carried in her body, a son. Jane would indeed give Henry what Anne could not. The following year, she bore him a boy, Edward, the long-awaited heir to the Tudor throne. And for that, Jane would be immortalized in tapestries, her image softly preserved as the true queen, the gentle mother, the woman who did not meddle or argue or bleed too loudly. She died shortly after childbirth, and Henry, for all his cruelty, mourned her sincerely. She would be the only one of his 6 wives buried beside him. Anne, in contrast, was left to rot in memory. No monument marked her grave. No statue bore her likeness. The children of England grew up hearing stories that she had bewitched the king, that she had seduced him with potions and spells, that she had slept with her own brother. Her name became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning to other women who dared to reach too high. Court poets mocked her, playwrights caricatured her, and in the great halls where she once danced, no one spoke of the queen with the raven hair who had turned a king against the Pope. Yet for all their effort to erase her, Anne Boleyn refused to disappear, not through force, not through rebellion, but through lineage. For as her name was buried, her daughter grew. Elizabeth the child once met with disappointment. The girl once declared illegitimate survived. She watched her mother die from behind a curtain of childhood. She listened. She learned. She waited. And 22 years after Anne Boleyn was executed, Elizabeth ascended the throne as Queen of England. Not the consort of a king, not the wife of a monarch, but sovereign in her own right, crowned with power, neither borrowed nor begged for. The daughter of a woman meant to be forgotten became the ruler no one could ignore. But Anne would never see it. She would never witness the coronation, never hear the anthems, never sit in the back of St. Peter's and see her child rise above the blood-stained legacy she left behind. Instead, she remained trapped in stories that were never hers. Blamed for seduction, for destruction, for daring to want more than what the world had carved out for her. And yet, in a way, that was her victory, because even without monuments, her memory lingered in the nervous glances of queens that came after, in the policies Elizabeth passed, in the fear the clergy still held for women who spoke too intelligently, moved too boldly, or smiled with too much knowledge. Anne had not simply worn the crown. She had cracked it open and shown the world that it could be taken and broken by a woman. And for that, she was never truly remembered, because remembrance would require reverence, and Anne Boleyn was never given that. Only silence, only shadow, only legacy. Part 9. A bedtime reflection, the woman who became a warning. 1,500 words. So now we lie still, in the hush of a late hour, and we ask the question that never really leaves. What was Anne Boleyn? Was she the clever seductress who schemed her way to the throne? Was she the victim of male ego, undone by the same ambition she once stirred in others? Was she a political mastermind? Or a tragic lover? Or a mother who never got to say goodbye? The truth, perhaps, is that she was all of those things, and none of them. Because Anne Boleyn was not a myth carved in certainty. She was a woman, And history does not know what to do with women who do not fit. She was too sharp to be soft, too witty to be silent, too independent to be palatable, too strong to survive. She lived in an age where obedience was currency, and Anne refused to pay, where virtue was measured in silence, and Anne spoke, where queens were meant to stand beside kings like statues, and Anne walked ahead. She laughed when she should have bowed. She argued when she should have blushed. She demanded when she should have obeyed. And for all of that, not one crime, not one proven betrayal, she was destroyed. And yet, still, she remains. She remains in the trembling voices of women who speak truth to power and are punished for it, in the fury of daughters who outlive the shame their mothers were buried in, the defiance of girls told they are too much, in the footsteps of women who have stood in rooms built to shrink them and dared to take up space anyway. She remains in every time a woman is called dangerous for being clever, in every time ambition is dressed up as madness, in every time desire is translated as wickedness. Anne Boleyn did not survive, but her defiance did. Her ghost walks not with chains, but with questions. She does not cry in the corridors of the tower. She waits, patiently, in the minds of those who look around and realize how little has changed. She is not the warning carved into stone. She is the one whispered between women who know too well what it costs to be brilliant in a world that prizes silence. They buried her in a chest. They stripped her of titles. They erased her from portraits. They told her daughter she was born of sin. But Anne Boleyn, the woman, the storm, the impossible spark, was not buried at all. She simply shifted form. And now, she comes to us not as a queen in silk, not as a martyr, but as a voice that does not go quiet when the sword falls. Remember me not as they wrote me. She whispers, remember me as I was laughing, daring, burning too brightly for their world to hold. And perhaps, tonight, that is how we leave her. Not with tears, not with fear, but with the understanding that sometimes the most dangerous thing a woman can be is remembered.